UN Global Pulse is an innovation lab in the Executive Office of the Secretary General. We're learning how to harness this new world of big data to understand when populations are changing their behavior in response to slow onset crises such as the food, fuel, and financial crisis that we've been going through for the last few years. The initiative came out of the financial crisis when world leaders were asking what was happening to vulnerable populations on the ground and how the crisis was affecting them. What they found, unfortunately, was that there was a broad information gap. Most of the data available at the household level was statistics that were between 2 and 5 years out of date by the time they were made available. This information may be useful for policy planning, but it is little use in a crisis. If you can't understand how populations are being impacted in different ways, you can't design different policy measures to protect them from harm. In many cases, you're left with no choice but to implement more crude and broad measures that neither protect these populations nor help markets stay afloat during these difficult times. We know that these crises can drive development in reverse, that you can lose years of development gains in a matter of months because you can't target specific populations with the policies that are required, and you can end up with people being driven into poverty for the first time. Finding out today that parents 2 years ago began pulling children out of school to work in a market is 2 years too late to keep those kids in school. Many of them will never return and complete their education. That's a lifetime of harm. But we have opportunities we've never had before. We're swimming in an ocean of real-time data that didn't exist even a few years ago. The private sector is using this information to power their business decisions. It's high time governments and the UN started learning to master this new kind of data, these new analytical approaches and emerging technologies to understand what's happening in real time and make policy decisions based on that information. Well, today there are many, many kinds of data that didn't even exist a few years ago. By some estimates, 90% of the data that exists in the world today was created within the last 2 years. There is online news in vast quantities. There is data created through the use of social networking sites. There's crowdsourcing of information directly from populations and communities around the world. There's remote sensing. And then there's what's called data exhaust. This is the information that people generate just by going about their daily lives. As people use services, they generate trails in the data that provide evidence of the changing patterns in the ways that they use these services. And we're not just talking about developed countries. In Africa, there's been an explosion of mobile phones in recent years. This has been followed by an explosion in access to cloud-based services, from everything from banking to money transfers to seeking health and education and job information, market price information, a vast array. We now have 5 billion mobile devices, and 3/5 of these are in the developing world. We see an opportunity to start using these kinds of data to track something that's been really difficult to track before, which is the descent into poverty that crises drive these populations into. We know how this process tends to unfold in the UN. It begins with people economizing, with them looking for additional sources of income. They may start to take out loans. In time, they spend their savings. They sell off what assets they've saved up. And then the real harm begins. Then they start making these painful sacrifices. Do we send the children off to school without meals so they can't study, or do we pull them out of school entirely to work in a market? We know this is happening, but it's hard to track. We can track food prices and fuel prices and rainfall, but we can't see the behavior changes until now. How do you think a crisis like the one we've been through in the last few years might have looked through the eyes of a mobile phone carrier? Would they not have seen people who normally put $10 a month on their mobile cards begin to shift to a pattern of putting 50 cents there every few days? A little later, depleting the amount of funding that they'd saved on their mobile cards, beginning to make calls to different places and different people than they might have previously, to different hotlines seeking assistance. We think there's a huge opportunity for monitoring here. If, of course, we can figure out how to do this in a way that protects their privacy, that protects the competitiveness of corporations and their intellectual property. This data will have to be aggregated and anonymized before it can be used in such a way. But we think the opportunity is here to use what we call digital smoke signals. when you see these changes in behavior, they don't necessarily tell you exactly what's going on, what the risks are, what the driving factors are, but they tell you that something is happening to that population. Can we then bring in new kinds of data, traditional data, to characterize what's happening, investigate what's happening, and respond with more agile policies? We believe we can. We are pursuing a threefold strategy. First, we're developing a novel monitoring approach that involves combining new kinds of data, what we call digital smoke signals, with traditional UN monitoring approaches and indicators, so that we'll be able to detect in real time when populations are being impacted. Secondly, we're developing a free and open source software toolkit that can be shared with the world for member state governments and other organizations interested in monitoring populations for the impacts of crises. Third, in order to test out what works, what doesn't, and why, we're implementing a network of innovation labs around the world in developing countries, beginning late this summer in Uganda. These innovation labs will bring together technologists, data analysts, and policy experts to experiment with new kinds of data and new tools and mainstream what works into government.